Welcome to the Western Bound podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled, Seeing the Bigger Picture. The talk was given by Elise Erro, EE, on August 10th, 2024, via Zoom. EE has been committed to a life of engaging spiritual principles and service through theater, support for the dying, and bringing enjoyment to others as a chocolatier. In this talk, there is discussion about how habitual reactions, which may be based in early childhood trauma, keep the world and our identities intact. EE says that we will encounter resistance in working with our known reactions, given that we fear the ending of the known. She describes ways of loosening the intensity of our patterns through self-observation and writing, which can allow for flashes of a bigger picture. In conversation with participants who attended the talk, she considers that we can hold to and nurture the experience that we sometimes have of who we are beyond the definition of ourselves that is based in the past. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Elise Erro, EE.
Joseph Chilton Pearce says, "Do not underestimate the power for keeping the world intact and familiar. That it operates largely below awareness is its strength." That's a quote from the book that he wrote called Exploring the Crack in the Cosmic Egg. But first of all, I want to set the stage for this whole talk. I want to tell you where the idea of the bigger picture came to me. I was traveling to Phoenix to take my spiritual teacher, Lee Lozowick. He died in 2010, I think. So he's no longer with us. But at the time, he was traveling alone, which was very unusual, to Phoenix, and he needed somebody to take him. So I said I would take him to Phoenix. And I was very nervous to be with him because I wasn't one of these people that would spend much time alone with him. So I had this idea that I really wanted to ask him a question. And so on the way down, I said to him that there was something that I didn't understand, and could he answer my question? And before he even wanted to hear my question, he answered. And the answer was, the reason why you don't understand is because you don't see the bigger picture. So I was focused on my question. So I asked him the question. This is about 25 or 30 years ago this happened. It took me a while to realize that he was actually giving me a very important piece of information. And that was that the reason I didn't understand was I wasn't looking at the bigger picture. And that applies to everything that's going on. Always remember to look at the bigger picture. Well, when I started looking at what that really meant for me as a spiritual student that practices self-observation, things started happening in a very specific way. And one of the things that started happening was that I started seeing a certain amount of resistance within myself when I started looking at what had gone on in my life. So the bigger picture is where I came from, what year I was born in, who my parents were, what was going on in the country at that time. So I'm a baby boomer. I was born right after the Second World War. My father had just come back. But my parents were also intelligence agents in Washington, D.C. Now, the CIA had just been started. So it was a brand new agency. First, my father was involved. He would go to work every day. He went to this new agency. I was 4 years old or something like that. Then my father got sick. It was said that he was mentally sick. And not soon after, my mother stopped being a mom and she went into the CIA. So my mother was the one that continued on being an intelligence agent. My father ended up going to a psychiatric hospital and having various treatments done to him, which is the way they did things in those days when something wasn't right. they often put people in psychiatric hospitals. Well, this happened to my family, but being a kid, I didn't know. So I just thought this was just normal, what families did. So I'm using myself as an example, but if you think back on your own life, where you came from, who your parents were, and how it was like for you as a kid perspective. My perspective had to do with what was going on politically in our country, how my parents brought us up. But I didn't realize as a kid that this was a very traumatic experience. So I actually wanted to go in this talk to this idea of trauma because I think that most of us have experienced trauma in their life. I didn't even know what that was till just a few years ago. So I am a student of self-observation. I think eventually that practice brings us back to where did I come from? Why am I reacting to it showing up in my life, which isn't really scary or frightening or dangerous, but there's something in me that's reacting. So I want to stop myself right there. I was listening to two veterans talk the other day about post-traumatic stress. One of them was a psychologist, one of them was in the forces. And he said, I'm not going to call it a disorder anymore because it's so common. But the fact that I've followed this track of my own life back to what happened to me as a child and not understanding that I was traumatized and that it probably eventually brought me to a spiritual path. Trauma wasn't even a word that when I was a young woman was even known about or spoken about or written about. But something just doesn't feel right. Something isn't working. I'm always doing these habits. I have certain habits. I can't break the habit. I started really looking at what that was. And the books, Self-Observation and Self-Remembering, have really helped. I've been doing this for a number of years now. Maybe I'm in the 5th year of studying these books and then restudying with a group of people. Some of you are with me today. And it helps so much to be able to go back into, I don't want to say into the past, but into what happened, because what happened to me, as an example of each of us, what happened is what has informed how I respond to life in the present sense. But I'm living out of the past. I'm living out of the programming of the past. And there was a lot back there that I don't want to be living out of that anymore. I don't want to be living out of the way my parents programmed me, how my life experiences programmed that. I wish to be opened up. As kids, we learn our survival strategies. We learn to survive childhood. But we don't see it that way. We just say, oh, we're grown-ups now, so now we should be beyond that. And I'm always surprised, and it happened again just a few days ago when I'm seeing resistance show up. All of a sudden, all the old questions, what do you think you're doing? Now look what's happening. Everything you're doing is wrong. And I just said, okay, wait a minute. What am I going to do about this? And I just started writing. So if you want any hints as to how to practically work with what is showing up, writing is a really good way to do that. And I started writing, and I just wrote whatever my inner thoughts were. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, well, this is nothing new. I've seen this pattern before. So using the tools that I'm working with self-observation, self-remembering, just come back to the body, be as present as possible, and be a bit kinder with myself. That's a new practice for me, being kind to myself. But you can't be kind to anybody else until you're kind to yourself. I know all this stuff intellectually, but when it happens and it hits, there it is. What do I do? So I want to be beyond that reaction that I was experiencing. The first thing that I did was I went back to writing. I began to write down things that I wanted to remember. It wasn't about the trauma. It wasn't about how I was feeling. It was about experiences with people that I had met and people that I wanted to remember and what people had said to me. So things were pulling me into the present. And I found that very useful. And I found that it's because I've been doing this work and it's so important to me that I was able to find help.
I want to say that it takes tremendous courage to share with us your experience. the psychiatric issue and the way things were handled back then. I know we all go through traumas as children, and I consider myself to have had quite a beautiful, loving childhood. I was very, very fortunate to have loving parents. My experience was that my dad died very suddenly when I was a teenager. So for me, my world dropped out from under me. It was like walking along, gee, this is a great day. And then all of a sudden, your dad falls off a cliff or something like that. So I understand what you're saying, because for me, it probably took me 40 years to try to find myself again.
Mm-hmm.
And even now at this stage in life, I am trying to bring out the little child in me, the playfulness,
Mm-hmm.
instead of the survival seriousness.
Mm-hmm.
If you can relate to that.
Yeah.
Because my life became tremendously serious. And so I was focused on making a living. It became a monetary focus of got to make a living, got to pay the bills my whole life. And that's hard to relinquish. It's really hard to let go of. And I went and did EMDR to work on that trauma.
Can you explain a little bit to people what EMDR is?
EMDR is eye movement desensitization, and I can't remember the R.
And reprocessing.
Reprocessing. Okay. So believe it or not, one of the sessions that I had, I actually saw myself as a child, as if that child was standing right in front of me. And that child looked forlorn, sad, kind of like a child would look up to a parent and say, "Are you kidding me? Is this what life is? Really?" Mm-hmm. That was the experience. So from that point forward, I promised that little child that I would love her and care for her and never leave her. Because I felt very much like at 16 when it happened, that I put her on a shelf and I went off to work. Life is serious. You can't have fun. So I hear you, because we all live through difficult pain and suffering.
We don't even know what trauma is until we're in the thick of it. And there's something that kept you going towards help. Joseph Chilton Pearce, his book is very much centered on homeostasis, which is the body's natural way of protecting itself and of bringing itself back into a stable, harmonious state so that it can be healed. The body knows how to heal itself, but oftentimes we aren't able to let that happen. There was another thing I wanted to say about healing and homeostasis. I remember one time I broke my ribs, got my ribs broken. And what happens when there's some kind of an incident, an injury to the body, is that the blood vessels and the muscles tighten up around that injury area to keep it stable, to stabilize it. And then healing can come in, the white blood corpuscles can come in and do the healing that's necessary. But what happens is that there's more constriction, which causes more pain. It's like a cycle of tightening up. And it's very much a metaphor for what happens, I think, psychologically too. We find these ways of protecting ourselves. And then in order to break out of that, if it's a physical pain, there are different ways, like medication, for example, can break that cycle of tightening so that the body can relax a little bit so that the healing can happen, then homeostasis can be realized. But in the meantime, there is this cycle of tightening up for the sake of protection. And I think that this happens also psychologically. And what we do is when we're hurting psychologically, for example, we'll turn to bad habits. When I'm hurting psychologically, what are the things that I go to? And do I want those things to be driving my life? And the answer to that is no, I don't want those things, but I do want to be protected and I do want to break this cycle. So for physical pain, there might be heat or cold, depending on what the injury is. Sleep is another one. So there are ways that we know how to help our bodies to heal. Like if you break an arm or something, you put it in a cast, so you stabilize the limb that's hurt. But what do we do psychologically when we're hurt? And what do we do as children? So those are the kinds of things that I've been discovering as I've been looking at this recommendation from my teacher that the reason I don't understand is because I don't see the bigger picture. Now, when I see the bigger picture, I get more information and I get more understanding. So if somebody has hurt me, or I feel someone has offended me or hurt me, if I'm able to relax enough to open up and even question, well, what's going on with this person? To even consider that this person may be coming from a point of view that I haven't even considered, it has nothing to do with me. They might be hurt. Something tragic may have happened to them, or perhaps they didn't mean to offend me. Maybe that's all on me. So my teacher's recommendation to see the bigger picture is really useful in this way. And then I can bring in the help that I have from my practice of self-observation when I'm able to do it, because sometimes I'm in the thick of it again. So it's not like you cure yourself and then you're done. Homeostasis doesn't work like that. You still got a body. I've still got people around me. I'm still going to get offended. I still have these old patterns. But do I want them running my life? And can I get to a place where they're not running my life anymore?
What's the connection between wanting to break the cycle, wanting to be beyond the reaction, and accepting what is? On the spiritual path, we talk a lot about accepting what is, accepting the way things are. So are those things contradictory?
Well, when I'm reacting, particularly with negative emotions, if I'm reacting with anger, someone's offended me, or even if I feel offended, react to anger with anger usually.
Well, acceptance, accepting what is that consistent with trying to break the cycle? To me, it sounds like those are contradictory in a way.
As long as I'm reacting from my childish programming, which is designed to protect me, then I'm not able to accept what is as it's appearing in present time. I'm being programmed from the past. This is what I'm seeing in myself. So is there a deeper question in there?
Well, one of the principles that really impacted me in working with strong reactions, and you could say trauma, childhood issues that followed me like a can tied to the tail of a dog through my life, was this principle of change happens through self-acceptance. And that accepting my reactions and not feeling bad about them, or I would feel bad about them, but being okay with actually feeling bad, just being with what is, was the way to break the cycle.
That's what I was saying. This came upon me the other day. I started writing. What was coming out first were all the can on the tail of the dog was like, oh, that's familiar. All these negative things about myself. But I just kept writing. I just kept going. And what I found was that there's something much deeper. It's like saying that she found that little girl in herself, but you have to go through the effort of being what. So when I was writing, I was being with what was going on for me. But instead of, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way, or this is because so-and-so and whatnot, I could trace what I was doing because I was writing it down. So that's one way of dealing with that.
I feel for myself
that
being with what is key. To be with all my reactions, even self-judgments, and consider the idea that I could accept that this is part of my personality. This is part of who I've identified as. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense given everything that's gone on. So I can be a little bit generous with myself or compassionate.
Yeah. But there was a time when I couldn't do that. And I think you could probably relate.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I mean, it's a process. And I don't know that one ever completely gets there or something. But as one's reactions become more workable, then I think you really can engage the spiritual path. So would you say that just doing that is spiritual work? Or would you say that there's more to spiritual work than that?
Well, I think that that's a good question that every person should ask themselves. My answer to that would be that from my experience, there's always more. There's always a deeper layer. There's always a bigger picture, literally. There's always a bigger picture than I've been able to see at one time. So that the spiritual path, like I said, it's not one and done. It's like it's progressing. And I think also depending on how you practice and where you find help, I'm finding myself, I'm going in a certain direction. I know where to go for help now. Whereas talk about trauma, I used to be depressive. Most of my adult life, I was depressed, taking pills, going to hospital, all that stuff. I remember saying to my teacher, they put me on these pills, but I don't feel like myself anymore. And he just looked at me and he agreed that I would follow my own path. It had to be my own path. And that's the other thing that I wanted to emphasize is that a lot of my life, I've been living with the stigma of my father being in a mental hospital. When I was a kid, my father was mentally ill and he never said that to anybody. There was a lot of stuff I was not supposed to say to anybody. A lot. So I gave a talk and I called it The Spy That Came In From the Cold, because as a kid, I was told, you don't ever tell anybody that your parents work for the CIA. There's always somebody watching you. And so I always thought there was somebody watching me. To this day, that comes up again. Somebody's looking around. Somebody's keeping an eye on me. I grew up that way. I don't want to live like that anymore. I don't want to live with that fear. So these things are getting revealed as I do this deepening process of self-observation. That was a really scary talk for me to give, the one that I called The Spy That Came In From the Cold, when I actually told people on Zoom that my parents worked for the CIA.
I'm thinking that it is amazing that you are at the place where you can recognize when you're going into those patterns, because that takes a lot. Here's a pattern for me. If I feel threatened or financially worried, or who knows what, I clean the house. And I'm a neat freak. So it doesn't need to be clean. But I'm at that place where I can look at myself and go, you know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I will just keep dusting or whatever. And other times I will say, stop. Mm-hmm. You know what you're doing. This is resistance. And you're trying to make yourself feel better by ordering things and organizing things. It is amazing what we do as humans to take that feeling away. I also know that it requires trust because there is a bigger picture. And the grace part of it is realizing that those traumas we had at children or any time during our life are what are honing us, are chiseling, mm-hmm. creating the amazing being that we are and helping that human part of us to see who that is. And that starts to open like a flower, just little by little. So it takes patience. And sometimes I have found that I'd pray and say, well, God, why can't you help me with this? Let me move past it, like you're saying. But I realize the lessons that God gives, if it was given yesterday or 20 years ago or whenever, I wouldn't have been ready. So it takes a tremendous amount of trust as well. Sometimes I liken it to a pinball machine. When they pull the pin and we're the little ball and we start bouncing off of the world, that's kind of what we go through in life at times. And that's not easy. But there is a lot of grace there. Sometimes we have to find a tiny little grain of grace and go from there and let that grow.
Well, it seems that there are a lot less healthy ways of dealing with anxiety than cleaning the house, than dusting. And also, I'm just thinking that loosening the intensity of our reactions helps us to see on a deeper level who we are underneath that. And that the intensity of our habits, our habitual reactions, keeps the world intact.
Yeah.
We are this person. This is who I am. I have these issues and traumas and reactions. And this is how I see the world. And if those can loosen, I think we have more of an opportunity to get a glimpse of where we come from.
Yeah, I think that that's what the whole gist of this talk is about. Recognizing it, first of all, and then be more and more in tune and in touch with our own habits and what happens, and really questioning, am I hurting someone by responding or reacting in a certain way? Am I hurting myself by reacting in a certain way? Because that's another thing in people who are acting out of their trauma. I would like to not have to act out of the trauma of my parents. They're both gone now, bless them. That's not the kind of legacy that I would like to carry on. I like this word loosen. We can loosen, because I think that sometimes that's how I feel when I'm in a situation where someone has been mean to me, or I think someone has, or something isn't going right, or I'm fighting with my manager at work, or whatever it is. I feel like the body's been hurt, so I'm all tightened up. So I like this idea of using the practices that we have and the training that we've had and what we remember to get to that place where I'm able to relax enough to be able to allow the loosening to happen. I also get a sense that I know what the next thing is to do. So I'm in a place where I can respond instead of react, even if it's just that much. If I can respond to something. If I can't respond, can I just stay with the negative emotions, even if they're inside me? Can I stay with those, not express them? And that takes some practice to be able to do that sometimes. When do I speak? When do I not speak? I think that that's a really relevant question all the time. What do I say when I speak? How do I say it? Am I considering another person when I'm speaking? Am I even listening to myself as I'm speaking to another person? Am I able to listen to myself, to listen what I'm saying as though I were another person? But all of it is in line with this loosening. The body knows what to do. The body knows what to do.
The other thing I was thinking is that sometimes our childhood experiences put tremendous parameters on us as children. I was a very prayerful little child, so I obeyed every little rule. But I also realized it literally made me feel like I could only stand on 1 square foot of tile at any given time. Like I was really limited. The parameters that we have placed on us limit us.
Yeah. I was talking to a friend of mine who has been in this work for a very long time, and he was also in AA because he really needed some help with some addiction problems. And he gave me a quote that came from AA, and he said, see if I can remember it. Oh, religion is for people who are afraid of hell, and spirituality is for people who've been there. So maybe you can relate. I didn't have a lot of religion in my life. I had some hell in my life. But like I said, I didn't know that that's what it was until I grew up. I kept looking for what was wrong with me. So that was one of the driving forces in my life. There's something wrong with me. What's wrong with me? And my teacher used to say, there's nothing wrong with you. You're a little bit annoying, but there's nothing really wrong with you. And it's taken me all this time to finally remember that he said, you're not looking at the bigger picture. When I started to look at the bigger picture, then I started experiencing trauma. I was traumatized, but I wasn't experiencing that trauma until I knew what it was. And then I started studying it. And I realized that that's how I was reacting and how it was keeping me confined in this familial meaning my family, prison. It wasn't their intention to do that, but that was the result. So I'm using myself as an example, but each of us has our own story and parameters. I mean, that's a very kind way. I used to literally dream about and think about being in prison. I was literally in prison, but I didn't know where the bars were, what it was. And now I'm getting to it by progressing on the spiritual path.
Can you see the bigger picture? Are the parameters widening for you?
Well, just to be able to see when I wake up and everything is wrong, I feel wrong. There's something wrong with me. That was an old one. Something really good just happened. And then all of a sudden, all of this negativity was pouring in on me. And I just went, whoa. And I couldn't do anything right. It wasn't like there was anything out there that was causing anything to be wrong, but I was seeing it that way. So I had a way to go. I could sit down and I could write when I finally started to do that, I just started writing what was wrong with me and what I was seeing. And then I was able to get to a bigger picture. I ended up writing about this amazing week I had just had and the brand new people I had met. But it's really interesting to see how the mind will collect negativity. And that's been a pattern for me. They've written books about it, and I read about myself all the time in these books. And it's like, okay, whoa, enough with this already.
Do you think that there's a part of us unconsciously that wants to stay this way
Oh, yeah.
so that we can keep the world intact,
Yes.
so that we can stay separate and identified just as this limited person? And we all have different ways of doing that.
Yeah. It's not like I don't have any more habits, but I know what they are and I know what they're doing. And I know what they're keeping me from doing. I know what the cost is. So these are new questions now. Instead of what's wrong with me, it's like, what is this costing me to stay like this? What price am I paying? Is this keeping me away from other people? Is this keeping me from being close to another person so that I might have to say something that's true about me? I might have to be honest about myself.
There's a quote that I like that I think is Jiddu Krishnamurti, which is, you don't fear the unknown, you fear the known ending.
Whoa. Oh. Well, I see that as an interface. I think that there is a fear of the unknown that's very, very prevalent. And that's what I'm working on in myself, because everything that I've just talked about, my past, where I came from, this confinement, this prison that I find myself in, that's all known. And the thing that's unknown is, for one thing, it's death. We can't know beyond the present. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here or something.
Being beyond the kind of reactions that you're talking about is the unknown. And what I'm hearing quoting Krishnamurti is that you don't fear the unknown, you fear the known ending. To actually get beyond all this that we seem like we want to get beyond so strongly is actually more scary.
I've had this conversation in many different forms with many different people. And what I'm seeing in myself is that what I would wish to do is to be able to face my own fear of the unknown, because it's fear that keeps me from wishing to go beyond. I mean, we can imagine all kinds of things, but that's imagination. We can't really know it until we're faced with it. That's why another part of the Gurdjieff work talks about working with shock. When your father died, that was a shock. It was a huge shock. And many of us take that as a trauma. It's the beginning of our trauma experience and all that. But it's not like there's not going to be shock. There's always shock, especially when somebody who you're close with dies. And how to be accepting of that without being traumatized. So at one point I said to myself, okay, all the symptoms are there. Because I'm doing this thing that brings on the symptoms, I'm re-traumatizing myself. So at one point I was writing about my whole family situation. I was writing for an hour a day and I was really going strong, really going strong. And then I was in a group and I was saying to my group, oh, I stopped about 2 years ago. It was like, what? So I had to go back and I looked at my writing. Why did I stop? And I realized because I got to a point that I couldn't rationalize the trauma that was coming up. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how deeply I was being affected. What did you say? What we fear is the known ending. I can relate to that. I say I want to get beyond that, but then if I don't have that story, who am I? I'm so identified with my story. But I do want to loosen this whole thing around trauma. I want to grow up and grow out of this. If there was that little child, I'm not you anymore, but I will take care of you. However you need to do that. But we can have a relationship with that one that was very severely injured as a child by what happened. Well, I'll write to different parts of myself that emerge and they have a agenda and they have a voice and all, and I give them a voice. I write them down on the page and to let that be okay.
What does seeing the bigger picture mean to you? And you say here in the write-up that specific practices that can be helpful in working with our inner life will be discussed, which can help us to see the bigger picture. So what does the bigger picture mean to you, and what specific practices help you with that?
Well, seeing the bigger picture for me these days is to notice, using the practice of self-observation. I see what's happening internally, especially I feel what's happening internally, and I stop and don't do anything about it. The most that I do right now is I take notes, because I found that that helps me to move what's going on. I have a spiritual teaching. I have a sangha of people in my community with whom I can ask for help or even just talk to. And I have these books of self-observation and self-remembering, and I can use the practices there. A stop exercise. Okay, hang on, just stop. This person really hurt me. Wait a minute, just relax. Sometimes it is a high practice of relaxing. Relaxing is a high practice.
So do you ever have the experience of being free of all that? So to use this language, a unified eye, where you actually see a bigger picture, life in a different way. Does that ever occur for you?
I would say at this point, more flashes, so I know that it's possible. I do not live a depressed life anymore. I'm still struggling with certain habits and certain practices of enduring the unpleasant manifestations of others and myself. I'm learning that the work that we do, that I do, and I have friends that help me with this work, is going to bring up resistance. And when that resistance comes up, I know what to look for, which is a third force. So if negativity is going on, that's the first force. The second force is resistance to the negativity, not by doing something else, but to know that it's there. And then the third force, which is the reconciling force, will appear. And that these are principles that I've only come to work with because I've seen that they work, and I look for them when I'm having conversations with certain people, and they are also aware of this. They will remind me, oh, that's the law of three. So we remind one another. So that's the benefit of working in a group, for example. I couldn't do this alone. I could not do this alone. Hang on a second. Got an animal. Hey, come here. Come on.
Intermission.
Intermission. I don't want my cat to get into a fight. What I'm finding is that when I apply a way of looking at whatever may be going on, take, for example, I woke up feeling depressed and all of these negative thoughts were going on. That would be a reminder of the old way of thinking, the old way of being, of reacting to having had a really wonderful experience. As a child, a really good experience always led to something really bad happening. So that's an old habit that I've got in there that's running the show at the moment. But because I have a certain amount of training, I have certain friends that I can work with and remind me of, oh yeah, the law of three is, so, okay, the first force is the dominant one. So the dominant force is all of this negativity that's going on. Then there will be a resistant force, the second force, and that will be the resistance to the first force. And then, okay, I'm going to write about this. Then what emerges is the third, which is the reconciling force. And once you've lived with these and you know these principles, I can begin to apply them.
These three forces that you're talking about, are you talking about the affirming force, the denying force, and the reconciling force? So I'm really not clear the example you use.
Well, the affirming force in this example I'm using may have been the days of really strong, powerful energy that evoked. The denying force is the negative reactivity I was feeling the next day when I woke up. And the reconciling force is what I did to reconcile, to balance out. It's like homeostasis at work, balance it out, which is when I was writing, I got to a very positive place. Remember, the first thing I said to him was, can I ask you a question? There's something I don't understand. He stopped me right there. He said, the reason you don't understand is because you're not seeing the bigger picture. And 25 years later, I went, oh, wait a minute. Oh. And then when I started exploring it, all of this stuff started coming out. And then I learned about trauma and all that. So it was very big. It was a very big deal. Why I didn't want to see it. Like somebody said, I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to get the big picture then, what he was saying. Although the rest of that ride was amazing. I've never had another one like it. But anyway, that's for another time.
Writing was the reconciling force for you, could be stated as that. And I kind of wonder what's beyond the trauma. I'm thinking of this quote of Marianne Williamson's horrible paraphrase. We play it small, and there's much more to us than we're accustomed to allowing. So I wanted to speak to that. What's beyond the trauma? The bigger picture.
That's a question that I don't think can be answered. I think that's a question to be lived into. I don't want to make things too formulaic because life has a lot of moving parts. So getting beyond the trauma, that actually was very much what I want to get to. I want to get beyond the trauma. But as I say, I would like to get beyond the fear of the unknown. But the only way to do that is to face the fear. That might have been why I spent a lot of time with people who are sick and dying.
I think that what's beyond the trauma is for we to live as gods and goddesses.
And what is that?
That is something that we need to nurture within us to answer for ourselves. And it's something that we can do in moments to begin with.
Yeah. You don't think gods and goddesses have trauma?
We need to hold that idea to understand what it means, is what is on the other side of the trauma. That is the bigger picture.
Well, I think we've all had some experience of that, maybe randomly.
Of what?
To use the language of being gods and goddesses, being free of whatever constrictions we have, call it trauma or whatever.
Yeah.
And to me, that encourages me because I might spend most of my waking hours not really living that, but I know it underlies my experience and is who I am. I feel to wrestle with these issues, you can go round and round, and for no reason, something just breaks through sometimes and you're free. At least that's my experience. I'm not sure that any particular practice brings that about.
Yeah.
But I think practice can help relax things so that might be more likely.
Frequent? Yeah.
I'm wondering too, if beautiful experience gave you that feeling of being a goddess, that gave you that feeling of the bigger picture, and you could align yourself with that. And then maybe the next day was like reality hit.
Let's not call it reality.
Yeah.
My past definition of myself came back to remind me, hey, wait a minute, who do you think you are? Like that. So point taken. We need to hold to that idea.
We need to hold it and remind ourselves of it. Let that be part of our self-remembering.
Right.
That's who I am.
And nurture it. It seems like that is when a breakthrough moment can be more frequent. If I'm coming from the place of, oh, yes, this is who I really am, not this old me, then it seems like there's a new possibility. How would you nurture that? Do you have experience with that?
Well, sure. You have to try to keep it in your consciousness.
Yeah.
The best as possible so it can grow.
Ooh.
Yeah, I was thinking, it seems like we get into the habit of really being hard on ourselves. We have unrealistic expectations about ourselves rather than just going, oh, I got up to go into the kitchen and I forgot why I went into the kitchen. Oh, well, that's just part of being human. And it's not a problem. I'll go back into the room and I'll remember why I wanted to go into the kitchen and go in the kitchen again. Try it out again. In my mind, the bigger picture is the flip side of our trauma and our limitations and stuff, which is how to recognize that there's a flip side. And by the way, that thing about the next day being down, that's a very common thing. When you have a great day, this happens, I think, probably to everybody, or to many people, at least to me. The next day, there's like a hangover. There's, oh, here I am again. I just do things and move past it, and then I meditate, and that's the best.
And clean. Yeah, but know what your habits are. Writing for me is the way to work with that, to get back to that place that we need to remember. The thing that I wish to remember is that I have a certain amount of training. I've had certain amount of experience with teachers who have helped me along my spiritual path. And this is what I wish to remember. I remember what it is that they wished for me. And I think to have a whole sense of myself, that's what I wish to have self-remembering be for me, a whole sensing of myself that includes all that has been given.
I think that our teachers see the gods and goddesses that we really are, and as the possibility inherent in us.
Yeah. I learned a new word, and the word is Siri. It's S-E-R-I, Siri. It's a Tamil word, and it means agreement. I am in Siri with you. Okay, just a minute. My cat really wants to be fed.